Hello again, and welcome to another online video lesson intended to provide you important principles and handy tips for the study and practice of argumentation. This is the second segment of a second part of a two-part series looking at the logical importance of evidence. The second part of this series is focusing specifically on how can we test evidence in order to evaluate how substantial and how accurate and how credible it is if we want to determine whether or not it provides sufficient support for a claim. In the last segment in this mini-series, we looked at the tests of reliability and expertise. The remaining tests are objectivity, consistency, relevance, access, and recency. So, in this next segment, let's take a look at objectivity and consistency. The next test we need to look at is objectivity, a source's tendency to hold a fair and undistorted view on a question or issue. If a source is objective, we say that this is a source that is avoiding bias. Now, it's important to note what bias actually means. What many folks think of when they think of the term biased is that somebody has a strong opinion on one side of an issue. That is not bias. One can take a position on a controversial issue and even take a strong position on a controversial issue and still have that position and express it objectively. What bias is unreasoned distortion of judgment or a prejudice on a topic. What makes a source biased is not that they have a strong opinion, but either that they've got an unreasonable, irrational prejudice that leads them to draw a conclusion in a way that's not really sound, or they've got some kind of conflict of interest or personal stake that gives them an incentive to want to distort what they're saying so that other people will believe it. If we're looking for objective sources as opposed to biased sources, this is where we want to go to mainstream reliable journalism as well as peer-reviewed research in professional journals. So how can we understand this idea of bias? Well, remember, what we want to think about is there some kind of incentive by the arguers, by the source of the evidence, that would want to distort the information? Let me tell you a story. Back in the 1950s, smoking was cool. Everybody did it in the movies. Everybody did it everywhere. It was just something you did. James Dean did it. It was cool. However, also in the 1950s, the medical research community is starting to find and disseminate to the public the results of research that's suggesting that cigarette smoking can actually be hazardous for your health, potential links to such things as lung cancer and emphysema. So, the tobacco companies selling cigarettes get really worried. They start as individual companies engaging in marketing campaigns emphasizing that smoking is okay. So, for instance, you've got this infamous Camel cigarette campaign, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. But the individual brand by brand campaign to beat back the science that was starting to accumulate on the hazards of cigarette smoking was becoming a real problem for this industry. So they banded together as the big tobacco companies and brought in the expertise of John W. Hill, the founder of Hill and Knowlton Strategies back in the day, and still, even to this day, one of the biggest and most powerful public relations firms on the planet. What Hill told the big tobacco companies was, you need to beat back the science with science. What you need to do is cast doubt on the veracity of what's coming out of the medical science community with our own experts. So, with the help of Hill, the big tobacco companies put together what became known as the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, along with its own scientific advisory board. They found a number of researchers in medical science. Incidentally, many of them were handpicked not only because they were skeptics about the cigarettes and cancer link, but they were also smokers themselves, and recruited them to the Scientific Advisory Board. The idea was to put information out to the public in the form of scientific research, casting doubt on the premise that cigarettes were unhealthy. In 1953, the TIRC releases a full-page ad in a number of publications entitled A Frank Statement to Cigarette Smokers that essentially lays out their manifesto in the form of providing important consumer information and their commitment to make sure that they're selling a healthy product. The core of this statement was the following. Distinguished authorities point out that medical research of recent years indicates many possible causes of lung cancer, that there is no agreement among the authorities regarding what the cause is, that there is no proof that cigarette smoking is one of the causes, that statistics purporting to link cigarette smoking with the disease could apply with equal force to any one of many other aspects of modern life. Indeed, the validity of the statistics themselves is questioned by numerous scientists. Now, who were the numerous scientists? The numerous scientists that were recruited for the TIRC and related folks that were getting research funding that was underwritten by big tobacco companies and their lobbying organizations. And so what the TIRC and their scientific advisory board did ended up dovetailing into continued advertising efforts, now trying to point out that there was scientific evidence on the safety as well as the pleasurability of cigarette smoking. Now, you might be saying, well, this was back in the 1950s. This kind of thing couldn't be going on today, right? Well, wrong. Let me tell you about the Heartland Institute. The Heartland Institute is a think tank and advocacy organization that provides alternative approaches to science for a number of different important public issues. But one of the most important areas of focus for the Heartland Institute over the past 20 to 30 years has been providing skeptical alternative accounts to the science on global warming and climate change. For instance, you can find on their website links to things like YouTube videos and speech transcripts from prominent scientific figures that are doubtful about the climate change thesis. For instance, this gentleman right here is Dr. Ivar Giaver. He was one of the 1973 recipients for the Nobel Prize in Physics. And he's been arguing for a long time that global warming is pseudoscience. Now, it's important to note that Dr. Ivar Giaver is a physicist. Specifically, he has degrees in mechanical engineering, a PhD in theoretical physics, and the work that he did to earn the Nobel Prize is on the behavior of electrons in semiconductors. He is not a climatologist. He's done some work in recent years talking about biophysics, but the only work that he's ever done in the area of climate change and global warming is to participate on a panel with other Nobel laureates that are not experts in climate science, talking about why they're feeling skeptical about the whole idea. Well, this is problematic, especially when you look at who provides the money that enables the Heartland Institute to do the work that they're doing. SourceWatch, which is a watchdog organization that looks at groups like the Heartland Institute, organizations that are specifically constructed and funded in order to provide advocacy that's going to support certain political and economic interest groups as well as particular industries. We can see that some of the most prominent funders of the Heartland Institute include the Koch Foundation, the Walton Family Foundation, the Sarah Scaife Foundation, the John M. Olin Foundation. All of these foundations and funds are organizations that have been putting thousands to millions of dollars over the years to support organizations that provide support to a number of different conservative causes. One of the major funders of the Heartland Institute for a number of years, until bad press forced them to pull out their funding, was the Exxon Oil Company. So you can see that the Heartland Institute is funded by people who are supportive of the fossil fuel industry and who have something specifically to gain by getting people to cast doubt on the veracity of global warming and climate change being caused by the use of fossil fuels by humans. What all of this means is that not only do we want to make sure that experts are experts, but we want to make sure that these experts, or whoever it is that's providing the information, is free of bias. If you are objective, you're free of those kinds of unreasonable prejudices or personal interests that would give you something to gain by deceiving the public. The next test we need to talk about is consistency. Generally speaking, if an evidence source is consistent in the way that presents information, it tends to be better than evidence sources that are inconsistent. And there's a couple of ways to think about this. First of all, Inch and Tudor talk about external consistency, the agreement of evidence with sources of information other than the source being used. So in other words, if you get some facts from a particular evidence source, that evidence source is going to be more credible if the information provided by that source is also pretty consistent with other sources of information doing similar investigation or research or compilation of facts and are coming to the same conclusions. This is one of the things that happens, for instance, in peer-reviewed scientific research. If a number of different researchers at different places publishing at different times all tend to come out with the same kinds of research results, they're externally consistent with each other, and the evidence is going to be sounder as opposed to one particular study presenting some research results that are inconsistent with everything else. Let's stick with our climate change example for a minute. What you see on the screen is approximately 200 global scientific organizations, all in agreement, according to NASA's Global Climate Change website, with the thesis of global warming. Specifically, the idea that the human burning of fossil fuels is the primary contributor to the massive spikes in global climate change that are resulting in the potential for future environmental catastrophe. The NASA site also reports on the following, quote, multiple studies published in peer-reviewed scientific journals show that 97% or more of actively publishing climate scientists agree. Climate warming trends over the past century are extremely likely due to human activities. In addition, most of the leading scientific organizations worldwide have issued public statements endorsing this position. So, let's talk about external consistency. If you run across a study that's funded by the Heartland Institute, or you run across a statement from a Nobel laureate in physics who is saying that global warming is pseudoscience, you need to think about that kind of information up against the 97% or more of actively publishing climate scientists, as well as the nearly 200 global scientific organizations around the planet that all agree that global warming due to human activity is a thing. So this is one of those areas that, while it seems to be a big political controversy with people arguing about it, when you actually get down to the evidence on one side or the other, sources that are telling you that the link between human activity and climate change is questionable, is very, very rare, is not peer-reviewed research by experts, and is inconsistent with the overwhelming global consensus by scientists who actually do research in this area. That is probably the textbook case of a problem with external consistency. Now, of course, we can also be concerned about internal consistency problems, the absence of self-contradiction within the information provided by a source. We see this kind of thing happen by political figures all the time. And indeed, it's one of the ways that we often judge the veracity of an argument made by public figures, especially politicians that are running for office or are advocating on one side or another of a controversial policy. The idea often gets described using metaphors like flip-flopping. Now, we don't want to suggest that people can't legitimately change their minds over time once they've been exposed to additional evidence, they've thought about it, and they've genuinely come to a different conclusion. That's called critical thinking, and we want that to happen. But we need to be skeptical about any evidence source that seems to be internally contradictory and inconsistent over a period of time on a number of different issues, especially if this internal inconsistency might be connected to a lack of objectivity as well. To illustrate a problematic source regarding internal consistency, let's take a look at some of the discourse from Republican U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham from South Carolina. Lindsey Graham ran for president in the 2016 Republican presidential primary campaign against Donald Trump, eventually lost the Republican nomination to Donald Trump, and then when President Trump was elected, Lindsey Graham was a campaign supporter of his and is now a fierce advocate for Donald Trump. Now, it's a pretty reasonable assumption that people change their positions in politics based on their strategic circumstances. But sometimes the things that are said by political leaders are taken up by the people who respect them and rely on them for information. For instance, loyal Republicans, Graham's constituents in South Carolina, and might not necessarily be thinking critically about the problematic political objectivity leading to some internal inconsistency. First of all, on the question, does Donald Trump have the temperament to be president? When interviewed by Fox News in February 17, 2016, during the presidential primary campaign, Graham said the following: "I'm not going to try to get into the mind of Donald Trump, because I don't think there's a lot of space there. I think he's a kook. I think he's crazy. I think he's unfit for office. And I'm a Republican, and he is not." Strong words, but you can imagine they're not necessarily out of the realm of what you might imagine a presidential candidate might say against another presidential candidate who's clearly out of the mainstream, unconventional, and is posing a problematic challenge. However, let's fast forward to November 30th, 2017. This is approximately 11 months into the presidency of Donald Trump and a little less than 2 years since Graham's previous statement. Here's what Graham told CNN. "You know what concerns me about the American press is this endless attempt to label the guy as some kind of kook, not fit to be president." Supporting and even defending a political ally that you were once opposed to is something that happens in politics all the time, and that's not something that we should be surprised by. But it is interesting that his indictment of the news media for trying to label Trump as a kook and not fit to be president is particularly intriguing, given that these were the exact words that Graham used to describe Trump earlier in 2016. A little weird. Let's go into another area. Is Donald Trump a racist? On December 8th, 2015, early in the presidential primary season, Senator Graham told CNN this: "He's a race-baiting, xenophobic, religious bigot." Again, strong words. And in this particular context, you might imagine that while one would politically support somebody in their party that they previously opposed is something that happens all the time, you wouldn't necessarily expect that same kind of change of mental and emotional support to somebody that you truly believed was a race-baiting, xenophobic, religious bigot. However, when interviewed by TV personalities on ABC's daytime show The View on January 18, 2018, about a year into the Trump presidency, Senator Graham said the following: "I said he was a xenophobic, race-baiting, religious bigot. I ran out of things to say. He won. Guess what? He's the president. No, I don't think he's a xenophobic, race-baiting, religious bigot. As president." So, in a really awkward way, he's trying to walk back what he originally said, characterizing it as, "I was just saying those things because I was running against him and I was trying to get ahead, and since he won, I don't need to say those things anymore, and now that he's president, I don't believe those things." We can see in these varying statements of Senator Graham not necessarily just the garden variety shifting of political alliances that we often see in national politics, but we see some really radical reversals on some very specific and pointed attacks on the character of President Trump. Whether or not that you believe that Trump is fit or unfit for office, whether or not you think he's a racist or not a racist, it's pretty clear to see that Graham's public positions on these issues have been radically internally inconsistent, which would seem to cast serious doubt on his credibility as to a true judge of President Trump's character. Can we really rely on what he has to say when he said such wildly inconsistent things? Okay, so we've looked at external and internal consistency and seen why it's important. Now we have a better understanding of two more standards for testing the quality of evidence in our arguments: the test of objectivity and the test of consistency. In the final segment in our discussion on evaluating evidence, we'll look at the final three tests that Inch and Tudor discuss: relevance, access, and recency. As always, if you have any questions about the concepts in this or any of my other videos, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.